JD Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a small, old-fashioned restaurant in the heart of Springfield, Ohio. The place had been around for decades, its neon sign flickering slightly, casting a soft red glow onto the pavement. Every time the door swung open, the smell of grilled burgers and fresh coffee drifted out, mixing with the crisp evening air. He had heard about the place from a local earlier that day, someone who swore they made the best homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries in town. Now, after a long day of meetings, handshakes, and exhausting policy discussions, all he wanted was a quiet meal before heading home. As he stepped inside, a small bell above the door jingled, announcing his arrival. The diner was cozy, the kind of place where regulars occupied the same booths night after night. A wall near the register was covered with faded Polaroids of past customers and longtime staff. The air was thick with the scent of bacon grease and coffee, and a gentle hum of conversation filled the room. JD caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She started to smile, but then hesitated, recognition flashing across her face. It was subtle, barely a second, but he noticed the way her expression tightened, lips pressing together in a thin line. He glanced around. A few customers had turned to look at him. Man midway through a burger leaned in to whisper something to the person across from him. A woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down a little too hard, her gaze narrowing slightly before she looked away. JD wasn't naive. He had been in enough rooms to sense when he wasn't entirely welcome. But in a small-town diner? He hadn't expected that. The hostess hesitated before stepping forward, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Good evening," she said, her voice careful. "Are you dining in or taking out?" JD let out a small, tired chuckle. "Dining in, if that's all right." Another pause too long for such a simple question. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I need to check something real quick." "Just one moment." She disappeared through the swinging door, leaving JD standing there. More heads turned his way. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered under their breath. Something was off. Behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell, too quiet to make out. JD exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but something didn't feel right. When the hostess returned, her hesitation was gone. Now, she looked certain. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice firmer. "We can't serve you tonight." The way she said it, the way the whole room seemed to tense, made it clear this wasn't about restaurant policy. This was personal. For a moment, JD didn't say anything. The words hung between them, heavy and final. The diner had quieted. Not silent, but quiet enough. The sizzle of the grill in the back still crackled. A fork scraped against a plate somewhere, but the usual chatter had dulled. People were watching, waiting. JD studied the hostess's face. She wasn't angry, just firm. Like she had made up her mind, or maybe someone else had made it up for her. His eyes flicked past her toward the kitchen window. Two cooks stood behind the counter, half hidden behind a heat lamp stacked with plates. Their expressions were unreadable. Clearing his throat, JD asked, "Did I do something wrong?" The hostess didn't fidget this time. "It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight." No explanation. "No, we're closing soon." Just that. JD let his hands rest on his hips, exhaling through his nose. He had been in plenty of uncomfortable situations, before political debates, interviews designed to trip him up, but there was something different about being turned away from a small-town diner. A cough broke the moment. JD turned slightly, catching the gaze of an older man sitting near the counter. He looked like he had been coming here for years, his blue work jacket frayed at the cuffs, hands weathered from a lifetime of labor. The man shook his head slightly, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing at the last of his eggs. A few booths over, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed, watching like he was enjoying the show. JD took it all in the eyes that looked away the second they met his, the ones that lingered too long, the ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. He had options. He could walk out, shake his head, let it go. He could demand an explanation, call them out, remind them who he was. He could challenge them outright, see if they'd stick to their decision once they realized they were refusing a U.S. senator. Instead, he did none of those things. "All right," he said evenly. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen, as if asking for silent permission. The old man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a short laugh, like they couldn't believe he was actually going through with this. After another pause, the hostess disappeared through a different door. More silence. A sip of coffee. A plate being slid across the counter. Then the door swung open, and a man in his early 50s stepped out, broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read Don. Don didn't ask JD what he wanted. He just looked him over once and said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't friendly. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. JD met Don's stare, steady and unreadable. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply, like he'd expected the question, but still didn't like answering it. He wiped his hands on his apron and glanced around at the customers still watching. "Look," Don said, shifting his weight. "This ain't personal." JD raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for. I got a business to run, and I don't want trouble." JD nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter, where the old man in the work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing slower now. A few booths away, the younger guy still had his arms crossed, watching like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. JD had seen this before, not exactly like this, but close enough. It wasn't about a single decision. It was about what it meant, how it would look, how people would react. It was about the pressure, the expectations, the silent rules that pushed people into choices they weren't sure about. He looked back at Don. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this, or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers curled slightly against his apron. For the first time, JD saw something close to discomfort in his face. Before Don could answer, the younger guy in the booth laughed. "Come on, man. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." JD studied him for a moment, then looked back at Don. "I've got no problem leaving if that's really what you want." The words hung in the air, giving Don a chance to reconsider. A chance to push back. Don's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to JD. "I just don't want things to get ugly." JD nodded. "Neither do I." Then, without a word, he pulled out a chair and sat down. "Then let's talk." The diner was quiet, the kind of quiet that stretched on for a little too long. JD sat still, watching as Don's expression shifted just slightly, not a big change, but enough to tell that something had cracked, even if just a little. Then, from the back of the room, a younger guy scoffed. "This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are." JD turned to him. "And who am I?" The guy grinned, clearly enjoying the attention. "You act like you understand regular people, but you play politics just like everyone else." JD nodded slowly, taking that in. "All right," he said. "Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The guy blinked, caught off guard. That wasn't the reaction he was expecting. "You want me gone?" JD continued. "Fine. But you've got the floor. Say what you need to say." The diner fell completely silent. Even the kitchen had gone still, no clinking plates, no orders being called out. Don sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "This ain't what I expected tonight." JD gave a small, tired smile. "Me neither." But for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division. It was about something else, something that felt closer to understanding. The people in the diner weren't just quiet anymore. They were watching. Even those who had pretended not to care were sneaking glances over their plates. JD sat patiently. The younger guy leaned back in his booth, looking like he wanted to say something but hesitating for the first time. Maybe because he realized JD wasn't arguing, wasn't defending himself. He was just waiting. Don, still gripping the chair in front of him, finally let out a breath. "You want to know what people think?" He shook his head. "They think you're full of it." JD didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly, as if truly considering the words. "They think you talk about working-class folks, but you still play the game. You make promises like every other guy in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing changes." Don exhaled through his nose. "And they don't forget." JD nodded slowly. "I get that." The younger guy let out a scoff. "That's all you're gonna say?" JD turned to him. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened up. "I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, defend yourself, say something." JD rested his forearms on the table. "You made up your mind about me before I even walked through that door. You wanted me to get mad, to fight back so you could feel justified." The younger guy opened his mouth, but no words came out. JD continued, his voice steady. "What if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like?" He turned back to Don. "You said nothing changes." "I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt left behind. And yeah, I went to school, did things people never expected me to do, but that doesn't mean I forgot." Don's fingers tapped against the chair. His expression was unreadable, but he wasn't dismissing JD anymore. He looked thoughtful. JD glanced around the diner. "You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. I walked in here as a customer, not a politician. Just a guy looking for a meal." A pause. Then, from the counter, an old man in a work jacket muttered, "Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger." The tension cracked just a little. A few people smirked. Even Don let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. JD turned back to him. "So what now?" Don exhaled and ran a hand over his face. He looked toward the kitchen, where the cooks were still watching, then back at JD. "I'll tell you what," Don finally said. "You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu." JD nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sounds like a deal. For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else. Like a conversation. The stiffness in Don's shoulders eased just a little. The younger guy in the booth had lost his smirk. Even the customers who had stayed quiet seemed less certain of their own judgments. JD leaned forward slightly. "All right," he said calmly. "Let's finish this conversation." Don exhaled and dropped into the chair across from him. "I'll be honest," he said, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you really look out for folks like us, or if you just know how to talk a good game." JD nodded. "Fair enough." Don studied him. "What I do know is that around here, people got long memories. They remember every promise made to them. Every time someone shook their hand, looked them in the eye, and said they'd do something only to walk away and never come back." JD tapped a knuckle against the table, thinking. Then he said, "I don't blame them for that." Don huffed out a laugh. "That's the problem, nobody ever does." From the counter, the old man spoke again. "Worked 35 years in a factory. Watched my neighbors lose their jobs. Watched whole families pack up and leave. Watched politicians show up, shake a few hands, then drive back to wherever the hell they came from." JD met his eyes. "Do you think I'm one of those politicians?" The old man stared at him for a long time, then shrugged. "I don't know. But I can tell you one thing, you're the only one who stuck around to listen." That landed. The waitress hesitated, glancing at Don. The two cooks exchanged looks. Even the younger guy had nothing to say. JD let the silence settle, then turned back to Don. "So what's it gonna be?" Don tapped his fingers on the table, looked toward the kitchen, exhaled again, then stood. "Mary," he called toward the counter. "Get him a menu." A ripple of surprise passed through the diner. The younger guy scoffed but didn't argue. Mary, the waitress, hesitated for only a second before grabbing a laminated menu and handing it over. JD took it with a small nod. "Appreciate it." Don shook his head, half amused, half in disbelief. "I still don't know if I like you." JD smiled, flipping open the menu. "That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me." Don chuckled. "All right, boys. Fire up the grill." Just like that, the tension faded. The diner felt like a diner again. Conversations picked up. Coffee refills were poured. People still had their doubts, but for one night, a different kind of conversation had happened. And maybe that was enough. Because sometimes, the real power isn't in arguing. It's in staying, listening, and proving that not everything has to be a fight.